Hello friends! It is time for another fabulous edition of American Presidential Reading Challenge supplemental books. Up until this point, these episodes have had a theme. That was because I had so many in a backlog that I could afford to do that. However, by this point, I'm just going to give you what I've read and talk about them. These are in absolutely no order except for vaguely reading order. So the one that I read longest ago is When the World Seemed New by Jeffrey A. Engel. This is a book about specifically President George Herbert Walker Bush and the end of the Cold War. I went through a period where I was really fascinated by the Cold War. I also read some others like Checkpoint Charlie, about the Berlin Wall specifically, but When the World Seemed New is a really interesting book if you're thinking about presidents in retrospective, because at the time when George H.W. Bush presided over the fall of the Berlin Wall and ostensibly the end of the Cold War, people really didn't like the way that he handled it in the moment. There were people saying that he should have been happier, and he was saying to the media, well, I'm not going to go dance on the Berlin Wall. President Bush believed that it was up to him to provide a even-keeled reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially, to help preserve world order. He worried that if he led a charge basically saying, ha ha ha, goodbye Soviet Union, that the world order would be really upended. And so When the World Seems New is a retrospective re-look at this period of time, because as we've moved further and further away from this period in history, George H.W.'s actions in this particular instance have been seen in a much better light. So just really interesting to see, the juxtaposition of how just in this relatively short period of time that our opinion has already shifted about this moment. The second book that I want to talk about is called Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell. This is a book about the presidential election of 1968. So 1968 is ostensibly the year that Richard Nixon gets elected, but there are a lot of things going on around that election that have a severe impact on our political world today. Now, when I read this book originally, I had not yet, for example, read my biography on Ronald Reagan. And when I think of Ronald Reagan, I think of the 1980s. I was not aware that Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1968, albeit a little bit half-heartedly, for example. 1968, according to Lawrence O'Donnell, is also when the last liberal Republican is put on the stand for the Republicans. It's a moment when any liberal Republicans become independent or Democrats, whereas a lot of Democrats who were once the so-called Dixiecrats, the South, become Republicans, because this is a huge shift in the parties and how they deal with racial issues, how they deal with some social issues. And also 1968 is amazing because it's only a few short years ago when Barry Goldwater ran, and Barry Goldwater runs on a platform that is incredibly similar to Richard Nixon's in terms of, in particular, his racial undertones. And while Richard Nixon doesn't run as conservative as Barry Goldwater won't really see a conservative equal until Ronald Reagan actually wins the presidency. But Richard Nixon is the first step on that journey. And so 1968, as this book posits, is this one presidential election where you can really see just like this huge shift that has set up the way that our politics still for the most part function today. And it covers all of the major players like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and it's just really interesting. It's like an encapsulation of a year and a political moment. I really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend it. I'm looking into reading more books about the year 1968. They do exist. I actually watched also a documentary on HBO about it and got some other names for books to read there, because I'm curious what other viewpoints will have to say about it. But I was just really fascinated by this look at a turning point in our recent history. I'm not going to do a full review of this one because I already did actually a full review of it. I just want to mention briefly The Soul of America by Jon Meacham. I did a books to documentary review of it, and I would highly recommend you go check that out if you're curious on my thoughts on that. But I think in terms of recent books, this is one of the more recent ones that I've read publication date wise. And I think that it's really interesting to read The Soul of America in the context of the year in which it was published, 2017, which was a year after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. People felt that we needed hope and optimism, as opposed to reading it then in 2020 or 2021 and being like, yeah, we've seen some things since then. So it just put it in a really interesting context, and I recommend you check out that review for more. I did read a very new biography on JFK, JFK and the Coming of Age in the American Century. Sorry, it's such a long name, I had to look off to the side here. This is a brand new JFK biography that will be published in 2 parts by Frederick Logevall. The second part is very not out yet, but what I loved about this book is that it was an intense look at JFK's early life. This covers his birth to when he becomes essentially an elected politician. This is a part of his life that most of the books that I've read about on him never focus on, because everyone is focused on his political career for obvious reasons. But it just sets up a lot about his life. It's all the newest research. There are still documents and things that are becoming uncovered or released as certain people die, you know, and they give up personal documents to history that they've been holding on to, stuff like that. And so it was just very detailed. And I was actually at one point listening to it kind of alongside the Robert Dallek full biography of JFK that I read. And whereas Robert Dallek would talk about something in a paragraph, Frederick Logevall would give it a chapter. And while I don't necessarily think you needed the chapter, the paragraph is quite fine in some of these instances, it gave me a very, very rich and deep understanding of some of these other finer points that you don't hear discussed a lot. So if you are a JFK interested party, I highly recommend it, and I look forward to reading the follow-up when it is eventually released. Okay, sorry if it just got darker in here, but my camera overheated and I'm back now, it's fine. Anyway, next book. So the next book was 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History by Jay Winnick. And this is what happens when you don't read the description of a book before you click borrow from the library. I assumed that it would be about FDR and how he changed the tide of World War II to help win victory for the Allies, because that's often how those stories go, particularly in American history classrooms, and not that it's wrong, but it's often a little bit more nuanced than that, and I thought, well, maybe this will be a nuanced portrait or something, I don't know. FDR's in it, it's 1944. I was in between audiobooks, so I got it. So this is about how the tide of the war changes, and it is about the Allies' decisions, but in particular, this book is about America and the Allies' relationship to the Holocaust. Specifically, how early England and America knew about what was happening to Jews in Germany. You will hear stories that say, oh, well, you know, they didn't know the full extent of it until Russia started overtaking German territory and discovered some of the first concentration camps. I mean, that was when they saw the full extent of it, when they saw a concentration camp, but there were escapees. There were people telling them what was going on. And there were multiple attempts to pass legislation to save Jews, to bring in Jewish immigrants. And you know what? There was a government, some people in the government dedicated to doing a whole lot of nothing. And it gets into the weeds of the bureaucratic response to Jewish refugees in the Holocaust. and mentions some things that I had never heard of, and has incredibly graphic descriptions of life in several concentration camps. And as someone who had expected just, you know, a book about the victory of World War II, this book was really intense. It was really intense, but I think really necessary. The end of the book ends up being about how, you know, America continues to try to return to a moment of isolationism, of saying, you know, we are America divorced from the rest of the world, and Europe's problems are its problems. And we've done this several times over the course of our history, and every time we turned a blind eye, things happened. I think it is important to realize that, especially in today's world, that's just not possible anymore. Globalization is real and has serious effects on our economy, people. So, a really interesting read, not at all what I expected, but I do recommend it. So the last book I want to mention, I'll just talk about briefly. It's called Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason. I read this book for the NPR Politics Podcast Book Club because I'm a nerd. And this book is a scholarly, it's a very short scholarly book from a researcher who was looking into the divide in our politics. And what I love about this is I think it goes back to what I was talking about in 1968, where there's this huge shift moment, because what Mason ends up showing us is these graphs, and she has so many graphs, and honestly I only know how to read half of them, so I'm glad that there was like pages of explanation, because I don't do this kind of like social psychology graph mapping stuff. There's so many graphs. Don't get the audiobook. Apparently it exists. Don't do it if you want to read it. But talking about how for the longest time politics in America worked because, yes, you were a Republican or a Democrat, but saying that you were a Republican or a Democrat didn't automatically say other things about you. You could guess that perhaps you had certain opinions on economics or stuff like that, but there were many more, you know, there were both genders on both sides, people of color on both sides, and while it's never been like a total 50-50 split, you know, there were people of multiple religions on both sides, like, but you really start to see more recently than you would imagine the term Democrat and Republican start to stand for so much more. And as we have solidified into these two teams, there's a ton of group pressure to follow that particular political party. It might not be what you believe, but it comes to be what you believe, to be with other people like you. We're used to it now, but it's become way more siloed, way more recently than you think. And it's just really, this is something that I've been, you know, aware of as I've been reading all these books, but to see her graphs, to see the demographic data just begin to like split, and also like in the perception of the other party. There was a time when a Democrat working with a Republican or a Republican working with a Democrat was the rule and not the, you know, exception, because that's how things get done. And we complain about deadlocked Congresses, and half that reason is that there's so much social pressure on Republicans and Democrats not to work together. So stuff doesn't get done, even if the individual members might actually agree on the legislation. They can't be seen bending to the whim of the other party. And then she goes on and she talks about ways that we could potentially begin to bridge these divides again. I liked it. It was very technical. It said a lot of things that I think are true. However, this book was published in 2018, and so while it does talk about these divides continuing to deepen and, you know, Trump's America and all that kind of stuff, what I feel like it doesn't do is talk about, you know, it's all about compromise, right? And meeting in the middle. And while I feel like you can maybe meet in the middle on economics, for example, you know, I don't think poor people should not be able to live, but I also don't think that we should be driving up the deficit to like Pluto. You know, I can agree with both of these things. However, the idea that gay, trans, people of color are not people is not something I feel we can compromise on. And of course, not every person in one political party believes that thing, but if that's becoming a big part of a party, she talks about like compromise and talking in several different ways to compromise, and like it's not a compromise there, you know? People are people. So I feel like the book is scholastic. It's a scholastic, you know, data collection thesis, you know, making sense of all this data kind of thing. But I think I kind of need it paired with like a more, you know, layman's friendly text that talks about how we then juggle, you know, being able to compromise, but also knowing when not to compromise, but still being able to get like laws through Congress so that we can all live. That's it for me right now. I will see you guys again, I'm sure, when I eventually read more of these, because, you know, I started thinking specifically about why I was doing this, and why. It's like 3 years, man. And I think it's just been this obsession with trying to figure out where we are and how we got here, in terms of our history, in terms of our government, in terms of our politics. Because the more you understand the history, the more you understand the future. Because you can, you know, begin to understand how decisions are formed and made, and hopefully also know how to better affect future decisions. So I don't know if any of this will ever have a specific point, but I feel like I've learned a lot and there's still much further to go. So thanks for stopping by this next video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!